This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 422nd episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. So, I'm back from my recent vacation to visit family and recovering from a fun bout of laryngitis, and also back to my halfway point review edit of my Portal Fantasy Work in Progress Dreambreaker. These review edits are always one of my favorite parts of the process. They're fully functional, of course, but because they're brief breaks in the actual writing, they also always kind of feel like little rewards. If I like what I read, of course, which I usually do, since I know if I have a problem, I will usually fix it as soon as I recognize it, rather than waiting for an official edit. I've thoroughly enjoyed every part of this book so far. It's so much fun to return to a previous story's characters and settings. Now, I'm asking myself why it took me this long to write a sequel. I understand now why so many of you are addicted to writing series. This certainly won't be the last one I do. And now, I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. How to decide between plain prose and beautiful prose. Truth is beauty. Beauty is truth. And this is perhaps nowhere more evident than in art, which deliberately and consciously explores both. Words, in particular, are the explicit context in which humanity presents, investigates, and shares its truth. Perhaps more than any other art form, writing gives us a blatant venue for exploring the truth side of the equation. But of course, as writers, we are also given the opportunity to create beautiful prose. It's the balance between the two that can sometimes get tricky. Much like the creative logical balance of writing storytelling, creating a meaningful harmony of beauty and truth demands two different skill sets. Learning how to evoke beauty from even the simplest truths, or truth from the most decadent beauty, isn't always a straightforward proposition. In fact, writing a story that is both beautiful and true is largely a matter of knowing when to utilize which. Lately, I found myself, rather glumly, realizing that I don't really write beautiful prose anymore. In fact, in my outlines for my last two works in progress, the superhero historical Wayfarer, due out this fall, and the Portal Fantasy sequel Dreambreaker, I made notes to myself along the lines of go deep in the narrative. This wasn't so much a craft instruction as a coded encouragement to myself to revisit the more poetic, quote-unquote, beautiful style of writing I had used in earlier books, such as Behold the Dawn. I admit it, I really love the writing in that book. Sometimes I'll pick it up just to read over the poetry of some of its phrases, and I'll wonder, why don't I write this way anymore? Despite my outlining directives, I seem to write less poetically, less lushly, less beautifully with each subsequent book. Yeah, there are some beautiful passages here and there, the occasional turn of phrase that just sings, but mostly the writing is more functional than elegiac. It's wears workaday clothes rather than party clothes. It's prose, not poetry. So what happened? Has my writing ability digressed over the years? Or have I maybe just gotten out of the habit of writing beautifully? That's what I was thinking until I read Ethan Kanan's essay Rehearsals for Death in that lovely anthology Light the Dark. He made an observation about the limitations of beautiful writing. He said, I have a theory about writing, which is that you cannot simultaneously write something true about character and at the same time write something linguistically beautiful. There are too few words to express both truth and beauty. I immediately resonated with that. Wasn't that exactly what had happened to me as a writer in between writing Behold the Dawn 14 years ago and writing all the books that followed? Even though Behold was the sixth novel I had written up to that point, it is really the book I view as seminal. It is the first of my books that I'm proud of. It is the first book I wrote as an adult. It's the book on which I refined my personal outlining process. It's not like I actually knew what I was doing when I wrote it, but it's the book where I started to consciously grasp the theories of story. From there on, my understanding of the truth of stories, as presented by plot, character, and theme, would grow with each book I write. I don't think it's a coincidence that with each book, my prose got less beautiful. What I hope that means is that with each book, the prose is also getting more truthful. Naturally, as writers, we all want to write both words that are beautiful because they are true and words that are true because they are beautiful. But it's important to consciously realize the purpose of each word, phrase, and sentence, which is called for at each moment in the story, the simplicity of truth or the luxuriousness of beauty. So today, let's take a look at the principles of writing both plain prose and beautiful prose. First up is 4 ways to write true prose. Tip number 1, know your truth. There are many facets to truth in a story. There's the foundational truth of theme, which presents and comments upon universal facts of life. There's the truth of accuracy in our researched facts. The truth of genuineness in our presentation of our characters as realistic human beings. And there's the simple truth of a well-placed word that resonates with readers like a perfect note of music. You can't convey any of these truths if you aren't aware of them personally. As we've talked about frequently this year, being a writer means assuming the sometimes heavy, always liberating responsibility of personal honesty. This involves much more than just passive honesty, accepting the truths you see, but also active honesty, seeking to identify and overcome your own misconceptions about yourself and the world. There will always be times when you have to fight to write true prose, when the truth is too abstract, complicated, or even unformed to be easily translated into words. But when you seek truth in every moment of your life, that truth will often show up in your writing without concentrated effort. Your writing is you, and when you are a truthful person, your truth will necessarily show up in your words. And by the same logic, so will your lies. Tip number 2, write what comes naturally. Here's a hashtag you know you are a writer win. You find yourself learning truths from your own writing. There are lines from my own books that I find myself quoting over and over again. They become mantras of my life and my personal beliefs. Obviously, I wrote these lines. They came from me. But it doesn't really feel like that. I didn't consciously know these truths before I wrote them down in their stories. Rather, it feels like I discovered the truths by writing them, by just letting the words flow out of me in the response to the needs of the story. As a matter of fact, the lines in my stories that feel most true to me are not the ones I labored over. They're not the truths I deliberately chose to share in carefully parsed sentences. They are, instead, these truths that just poured out naturally when I wasn't looking. And the lesson here is, don't worry too much about being quote-unquote truthful. Sometimes that kind of awareness can be a fast track to preaching. After all, truth is such a lofty word. For any of us to assume we own some great truth that no one else has discovered is not only arrogant, but, most ironically of all, untrue. So while it's great to deliberately share the insights life has taught us, it's even more important to simply open ourselves to the page, eliminate any censorious impulses, and just see what flows out. Tip number 3, write simply. Short sentences, small words. Beauty needn't always be decadent. Sometimes it needn't even be, strictly speaking, beautiful. There is beauty, even in ugliness, when that ugliness is true. In his essay, Kanan went on to comment, most empathetic, or another way to say this might be character-driven, writers tend to naturally reserve their beautiful constructions for when the content is less urgent. You'll see Saul Bellow get poetic when he's writing about scenery. But when he's trying to write something that really gets to the narrator's deep emotional experience, the prose is mostly very simple. That was how he was. 5 plain words. One of the passages I'm most proud of in my own writing is a scene in Dreamlander that presents the protagonist with his first experience of war. It's the benchmark I always use in challenging myself to write honestly. In writing this scene, I use the old trick of putting myself in the character's shoes and asking, what would I be thinking? The answer I came up with was a single simple phrase that got repeated over and over throughout the scene. So this is war. Plain words, short sentences, and simple constructions all lend themselves to the clarity and emphasis of truthful statements. They stand on their own. They never get in their own way. they're unvarnished. Tip number 4, seek subtext. Let readers find their own truth. Something life has taught me, you can't give someone the answers. They have to find the answers for themselves by first asking the right questions. The same is true for your readers. You may want desperately to share important truths with them, but just handing them those truths will often be, at best, ineffective. Asking them to do a little work, to look for the truth, to make an investment of themselves in your story, that's where truthful writing rises above platitudes to the level of transformative experience. So, how do you do this? By not sharing all the truth. In several short sentences about writing, Verlin Klinkenborg notes, the longer the sentence, the less it's able to imply, and writing by implication should be one of your goals. Subtext is the most powerful part of any story. Why? Because it speaks directly to the subconscious. It's the hidden part of the story reaching out to the hidden part of the reader. Creating truthful subtext begins by creating truthful context, which sits upon the foundation of all three of the principles we've discussed so far. Writers must seek the connection between conscious and subconscious, outer experience and inner experience, to the point that we grow skilled in prompting readers to understand the truth of the subtext based on nothing more than the outstanding truth of our context. If writing truthful prose is primarily about getting out of the way of your own honesty, then writing beautiful prose is actually a little more craft-oriented. So here are 4 ways to write beautiful prose. Tip number 1, practice poetic techniques. Beautiful writing is often called poetic writing, and for good reason. Poetry is a pursuit of truth through beauty. It uses wordplay and word tricks to please both the eye and the ear. Some of the best of these are, number 1, rhyme. Even in prose, you can occasionally make use of rhymes to smooth the flow. This can get corny really fast, but used skillfully, it blends into the prose, creating gentle beauty without necessarily catching the reader's conscious attention. Number 2, rhythm. Perhaps even more important than word choice is the balance of your sentences in evoking beauty. A mix of sentences, short, long, simple, complex, compound, fragment, run-on, gives you the tools to create music on the page. 3, alliteration. Also to be used with sparing care, alliteration is the technique of choosing multiple words with the same beginning sound, such as beautiful, blonde, bombshell. Used with subtlety, so it does not draw undue attention to itself, alliteration creates both the beauty of pattern and enhanced meaning via repetitive emphasis. Tip number 2, seek vivid analogies. Sci-fi wizard Robert Heinlein may have claimed in Starship Troopers that analogies are always suspect. But he was talking about political science, not beautiful prose. Analogies, similes, and metaphors are the gateways to understanding. They allow us the opportunity to shed greater clarity and insight on prosaic items and ideas by exploring their similarities with other items and ideas. A well-placed simile or metaphor can immediately skyrocket your prose into top-notch prose poetry. But analogies are easy to abuse. Comparing your heroine's wedding dress to a cloud of toilet paper might seem apropos in the rush of the first draft, but on revision, you may realize that the plainer white might be the better descriptor. Tip number 3, expand your vocabulary. In alignment with Kanan's original idea that stories are often either truthful or beautiful, some of my favorite books are not those that do an objectively excellent job with plot and character, but rather books that are simply beautiful in their choice of words. Some of these words are the plainest and simplest, but often beautiful prose is the result of a vocabulary master who knows how to discover and use beautifully unusual words. For example, a recent phrase that I loved in my own reading was Brent Weeks's blood incarnadine the water from his fantasy Bloodmere. You can't use beautiful words to beautiful effect unless you know the words. Become a student of vocabulary. Master your words. Naturally, don't use big or unusual words just because they're big or unusual. But add enough of them to your repertoire so you have the right one for the right moment. And tip number 4, choose the right moment. The ability to craft and use beautiful prose is a talent every writer should hone. Beautiful prose will set you apart from other writers just as surely as the ability to craft solid plots. But you must know when to employ beauty, and when doing so will just get in the way of the story's impact. Canaan, again. At the crux of the story, it pays to write what's true, rather than try to write what's true and then dilute it by making the prose beautiful. It's a continuum, of course, but I don't think you can be at both ends of the continuum. As for me, I'm no longer worrying that my prose isn't beautiful enough. There are appropriate moments in every story for poetic passages, but the story comes first. And most of the time, that means focusing more on honest prose than elaborate prose. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.